Many of you know I have a deep love for video game music, but did you know that this love is so deep is part of the reason that made me want to become a musician and study composition in the first place? It's always been my dream to become a video game composer, and recently I've gotten to live it out just a little bit. Today I'll show you how I was able to create not only music but also the sound effects for my first video game. Becoming a composer in either film or games is extremely challenging. Not only because the skills are very hard to acquire, but because it's also a very saturated field. For every video game studio, there's probably dozens, if not hundreds, of composers sending cold emails each week, hoping to land just a small gig. Composers aren't usually hired for an in-house role, so they mostly have to hunt for the work they do get. Here's some of the ways that they do that nowadays. Either they're building a strong, authoritative social media presence, or they're doing a lot of cold mailing and maybe getting 1 gig for every 100 emails you send out. They're making music packs at a very low price, hoping that people might want you to custom score their game if they buy your pack, and networking using game jams. Most of the time, you're doing a combination of all of these things. This video is specifically focused on the latter of those options, which is the game jam. For those outside of the sphere of game developers, game jams are essentially events where developers and artists get together to make a video game under a constrained amount of time, to test their skills and to network with other people. If you do well, it could also provide you some exposure for any upcoming games you're working on. You can see a game jam for as short as 24 hours to as long for a couple of months. These games aren't necessarily made for profit, they're just a way of feeding growing developers a way to improve with each other. Last weekend was filled by a pretty big game jam from a pretty big YouTuber named Game Maker's Toolkit. My team had about 96 hours, I believe, to make a game that represented the theme built to scale. The first day was spent just throwing ideas out to see what type of game we wanted to make, and at first we were leaning towards a platformer that had platforms you could change the size of, but then we leaned into a game where you use boxes to solve puzzles by changing the size of the box. As a composer, usually music comes as the last step in most media you're working with, so honestly I didn't have a lot to do for the first couple of days until the basic art direction and main character was mapped out. So I started out by making maybe the most important sound of the game, the gravity gun we'd be using. I'm not personally the best sound designer. I think I'm better at music than sound, but it's a skill I'm actively working on right now, and I also think it's pretty fun in its own category outside of music. For the gravity gun, I thought of it as a beginning, middle, and end when I was making a sound. I added a mechanical click to signify the gun sound in the beginning, followed by a riser to add some momentum, and then a very heavily processed liquid sound introduced a very sci-fi element to it. And then I had some plastic rubbing sounds just kind of fill out the rest of it. The middle section of the sound was the simplest, with just a sine wave with a bit of tremolo, and then I duplicated it an octave higher. For the end, I kept it simple. I used the riser to push more momentum into it, and then I used the liquid sound again, but then I pitched it down a little bit just to make it kind of different, to give it a definitive let go feeling. Finally, I added some compression and reverb to glue the whole thing together. Here's the whole thing together and the sound and context of the game. I think it works pretty well. A lot of the other sounds were pretty simple outside of that. For the jump sound, I used the sound of a whip slashing through the air and the sound of a cloth being punched together with a bit of compression and reverb. Some other sounds like the steps required me to be a bit more active with the processing to make it sound good enough, but the sounds I was most proud of came out to be the UI sounds, which definitely wasn't stolen from another YouTuber. At first, I was kind of overthinking the sounds for this. I was like, man, how do a great UI sound? I gotta, really crack in. But then I stumbled across the video that pointed me towards the right direction, which will be linked in the description below. So for this sound, I used a soft synth called Vital through a process called synthesis. Synthesis is essentially the process of you crafting artificial sounds with basic waveforms and processing. You can get really crazy with it and can even synthesize some animal sounds with it. I'm not that good yet, but I can do some basic stuff. So I used this wavetable synth and this sine wave to get this bass sound, and then I just added some other effects onto it if I thought it sounded good. Then I just, pitched the notes to represent the different UI sounds. A simple navigation was just C, but then the start sound would be a quick arpeggio leap and some other variations I had. I put recommended titles for the sounds, but ultimately the programmer could choose between the different variations depending on what they needed. After finishing the rest of the sound effects that the team needed, it was time for me to work on the main song of the game. And really, we only had one setting and didn't have enough time for multiple levels, so I only really had to make one song. Speaking of video game music though, that introduces me to today's sponsor. I've recently released a 12-pack music pack dedicated towards JRPG music, currently available on itch.io and Gamedev Market. I really spent a lot of time making sure that the music was special and not just generic orchestral music. And I also have a free 5-pack sampler below in the link if you guys just want to have 5 free tracks for your games or anything. We threw out a couple of genres that we thought might have fit the game, like jazz and electric 80s type music, but I ultimately went for a different direction when I saw the finished art of the game. It kind of reminded me a bit of that like early 2000s rom-com aesthetic, like in the way how it's a very kind of cutesy art style and it's very kind of like homemade-esque, to me. So I listened to a bit of the music from one of my favorite shows within that style, and it's School Rumble, to kind of get an inspiration for the music. One of the main characteristics for the 2000s rom-com anime in my head is this simple like slide synth lead. It's kind of everywhere in that type of anime genre, and it sounds pretty good. I recorded a rough melody line on my phone just to kind of get some ideas, and then I used something close to it when I was playing through the synth instrument. Because I wanted the song to have kind of more Japanese elements, I used some standard Japanese progressions for the harmony below the melody in both sections of the song. Also, another important part of the song was for me to not have it too active. This music was gonna accompany a pretty casual puzzle game, so I decided to use miscellaneous percussion instruments outside of a regular drum set to keep the groove of the song but making sure it's not too hard hitting. After mixing and mastering the music, this is what I ended up with. I also made a victory theme at the end, I think it's pretty cool. This first experience making music for a game lets me feel a bit closer to my heroes of the present and the past who really dominated and continues to dominate the space as prolific game composers. I'm currently working harder to seek out more work and more opportunities to make music for video games, and I will document more substantial progress I have on this channel. So subscribe if you want to have any more updates. Also, just to let y'all know, the next video is already in the pre-production phase and will be one of my biggest videos yet. Till next time.